So we have today the RPKI track, and there's two presentations. For the first one, I would like to introduce Gautam Akiwate. He will be presenting stop, drop, and ROA, effectiveness of routing defenses through the lenses of drop. Gautam is a postdoctoral researcher at Stanford University, and he's coming to us today from Palo Alto, California. This is his first NANOG, but his second time presenting on the NANOG stage today. And it's a pleasure to have him speaking for us again. Thank you. Welcome, Gautam.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. My name is Gautam Akiwate, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Stanford University. The title of my talk today is Stop, Drop, and ROA, Effectiveness of Routing Defenses Through the Lens of Drop. This work was done in collaboration with the folks at UC San Diego and CADA, and also the University of Waikato in New Zealand. So the reason we started looking into this space was because we realized as academics have little insight into how attackers actually make use of address space. How are attackers able to subvert routing defenses and falsely assert ownership of someone else's address, and then use this address space for malicious activity? And this problem is well known, and I'm sure I'm in the midst of operators, so all of you folks are aware of this problem, and it has been going on for a long time. And over time, there have been a couple of solutions that folks have come up with. So the first solution is block lists. And essentially, the idea here would be we make a list of all of the abusive prefixes, put them in a list, and then drop them, preferably at the data plane. The next solution that has been considered is being able to detect hijacks. And in this case, we would try and detect these hijacks near real time. But then again, we are waiting for hijacks to happen. And this is kind of after the fact. And it's also kind of complicated to get it right. The third one that is going to be the focus of our talk today is going to be validating announcement origins. And this traditionally was done using Internet Routing Registries, but nowadays we're doing it using RPKI, which uses the RIRs as ground truth measurement. And finally, last but not least, we have BGP-SEC, which has not been it's been actively worked on and not fully deployed. But that's the one that sort of promises the whole path being validated. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to use data from the block lists in order to understand how malicious attackers were able to subvert routing defenses like IRR and RPKI. Or put in other ways, what can block lists tell us about the effectiveness of IRR and RPKI as routing defenses? And note that I have routing defenses in quotes. And that is because when we went to RFC 6811, we were surprised when RFC 6811 said that RPKI is not a security mechanism. It's not a routing defense. And this is the text in the RFC 6811. The attacker need only prepend the valid source AS to a forged BGP route announcement. RPKI does not protect AS in the middle attacks, does not provide any path validation, and should be thought of as protection against misconfiguration than as security. And this is some foreshadowing here. We're going to see how 6811 basically predicted the future. So which block list are we going to use? We're going to use drop because drop is well documented. It only puts the seriously abused prefixes. Every prefix that gets added to drop has an entry as to why it was added to the drop list. It has different categories, with one prominent being hijack subcategory. Each of the entries is vetted by a human. And more importantly, this list is public, and thus all of our work can be reproducible. Of course, there are some limitations. It is small. We cannot really make any claims about it being representative. And of course, we're not making any arguments for causation, but just correlation. So what does this data look like? So we use 3 years of drop data from June 2019 to March 2022, has roughly 712 prefixes. And then for each of these prefixes, we know what kind of activity got it blocklisted. There are roughly 6 categories. And out of these, we are going to study the hijacking and the unallocated prefixes, because those are the ones that would benefit from routing defenses in general, and IRR and RPKI in particular. And if we look at the address space that these prefixes cover, hijack and unallocated cover most of the address space as covered by drop. But there is a small caveat here. A lot of the address space that's actually here is a result of incidents with Afrinic, which are not necessarily hijack. And since there is like a sensitive issue there, we decided to exclude it from our analysis because it's not what we think of traditionally as hijack. So the question that we asked ourselves, finally we get to the results, which is, do drop prefixes get withdrawn? And we see that 20% of prefixes that get added to drop are withdrawn within 30 days. But for prefixes that were labeled hijacked, this number is as high as 71%, and for unallocated, it is 55%. In fact, we see 3 full feed route views peers actually BGP filter drop prefixes. And I'm not sure what Spamhaus has to say about that, but I don't think they meant it as a control plane filtering, but in fact, data plane filtering. So it's interesting that there are routers out there that are actually doing this. The other question that we asked was, what effect might drop have on RPKI? So how does drop change incentives for operators? So we are going to take all prefixes without a ROA as the start of our measurement period. And then we are going to categorize them by our RIRs into 3 categories. The first is never on drop. So in the time frame of a measurement from June 2019 to March 2022, they were never on drop. And this is going to be the base case. This is going to be, we are going to expect most of the prefixes to be here. The second is going to be the prefixes that were removed from the drop list at the end of our measurement period. And finally, prefixes that were not removed from drop at the end of the measurement period. So let's look at some numbers. We see that different regions have different background RPKI signing activity. And in some sense, this is the control. Most of the prefixes here were never on drop, and this represents the largest number of prefixes and what we would expect in the base case. And so 22.3% exhibits like the base signing rate across all RIRs. And you can see between different RIRs, we have a difference in RPKI uptake. And I'm told that this is because some RIRs make it easier than others to sign ROAs. For the second category, we see that if your prefix was on drop and was then removed, the RPKI uptake here is much higher, is nearly double if you were never on drop. And this might be because Spamhaus requires, as a precondition of being removed from drop, they require you to sort of do certain things to show that you will never, you won't indulge in abusive activity again. And part of that might be signing ROAs. And finally, as we expected, if your prefix is not removed from drop, we see that those prefixes are signed at a much, much lower rate. So here's the hijack of the RPKI-signed prefix that RFC 6811 warned us about. In the beginning, till July 2020, we see AS 263692 advertise this prefix. In July of 2020, it stopped. And then AS 50509 started announcing this prefix along with 3 others in December of 2020. For 3 of these prefixes, it stopped in July of 2021 and replaced them with 3 other prefixes. And in each of these cases, the attacker only stopped when Spamhaus added them to the drop list. So it was only when Spamhaus added them to the drop list that the attacker withdrew their announcements. So this shows that there is a key issue with RPKI, with our understanding of RPKI, which is an RPKI-signed prefix that is abandoned, that is not routed, is no more protected than any other unrouted prefix, as attackers can spoof origin ASN. Okay, and that was a key insight here, was that basically unrouted prefixes are as likely to be hijacked regardless of whether you have RPKI signed or not. Well, that's not really true, because RPKI sort of accounts for this and has an AS0 mechanism in here. And there are 2 types of, and basically what AS0 ROA asserts is that this prefix should not be routed. And there are 2 types of AS0s, both of which we are told have slight issues with them, and we'll discuss what they are. The first type of AS0 is the RIR AS0, which RIRs may use for unallocated prefixes, so that hijackers cannot really use unallocated address space for their abusive activity. The second is the operator AS0, which is for unrouted prefixes that operators may not be currently using. But as I mentioned, each of these AS0 policies have some political sensitivities. From what we are told, operators are not thrilled about RIRs having AS0 capabilities, because it means that RIRs can essentially, by adding entries into this AS0 chart, might be able to take away address space from operators. On the other hand, operators are not thrilled about adding AS0s for their own paths, because that indicates that they are not using this address space, and it might signal to RIRs that they can take it back for subsequent allocation based on need. I don't know how true that is, but that's what we were told, that one of the concerns that operators had with using AS0s was this fear. And it also looks like the RIR AS0 policies have limited effect. Though that said, this could also be because the only 2 RIRs that do this are APNIC and LACNIC, and also because the 2 AS0 RIRs are on a different trust anchor locators, TALs, and as a result are not used by anyone. And which is why we see unallocated prefixes for even these RIRs continue to be added even after the RIR implemented this AS0 policy. So basically, having this on an alternate trust anchor locator does not really work. And given that there is still unallocated space in 3 RIRs, we as a community need to sort of figure out if AS0, like the RIR AS0 is not the right solution for us, then what is? And since there is a lot of unallocated space out there, that is prime for hijacks. So on the other hand, for allocated prefixes, we see that the rate of like ROA signing for these allocated prefixes is going up. And in fact, it has more than doubled in the last 3 years. At the same time, we see that there is a gradual reduction in unrouted address space that is not covered by ROA. So basically, this is address space that is allocated but not currently used, and it doesn't have any RPKI. So this is prime targets for hijackers. But in addition, as we saw in our example, an RPKI signed prefix that does not have AS0 in it is no better protected than an allocated unrouted with no RPKI. So this 6.7/8s, which is allocated unrouted but non-AS0 ROAs, are as likely to be hijacked. just by AS path prepending. And a prime reason of why this has happened is because over time, we have seen that address space that was covered by ROAs has slowly started decreasing. And from like a high of 97%, we are now at 90%. And actually, most of this, like 70% of this, can be explained by three orgs: Amazon, Prudential, and Alibaba. So in fact, we did do disclosures to them. So as of this presentation, we're not sure if this has been fixed or not. We're happy to talk to folks to explain what our rationale here is. But yeah, 70% is just three orgs. And if they add AS zeros, we might be gold. So here are the key findings. The good news seems to be that drop seems to improve incentives. Prefixes that were on the drop and were removed from the drop had an higher RPKI uptake. And also, being on the drop list made attackers, hijackers withdraw their announcements. The bad news is that attackers are subverting defenses. So I know I didn't talk about IRR, but we found that in almost all cases, hijackers would insert entries into IRRs, fraudulent entries into IRRs for prefixes before using them. And so in fact, having an entry added to IRR was almost a predictor of hijacks coming. And I'm sure as operators, you have already noticed that, which is why I didn't even we didn't even talk about IRR as a routing defense, because it has a lot of flaws. On the RPKI side, we saw that there was a lot of spoofing going on with the AS consistent with historic route announcements. And this, in effect, is to defeat a lot of the hijacking detection mechanisms, which sort of use origin AS mechanisms to identify hijacks. And finally, the one that we saw were announcing with AS in the ROA. So basically keeping it consistent with the RPKI-signed ROA, the origin announcement in the ROA, to make sure that everything checks out and you're able to defeat RPKI. So the attack surface, as I said before, is everything that is unrouted. Unrouted is fair game. 6.7/8's worth of RPKI-signed unrouted prefixes or address space, and 30/8 equivalents of unrouted but not RPKI-signed. So all of these IP addresses are hijackable by attackers. So some final thoughts. It looks like the US FCC is also now involved in the routing security solutions. And we were reading through some of the comments, and there were a lot of interesting comments. And as academics always prefer more transparency and accountability, and we absolutely love working with a lot of the operators, and we have had great collaborations with them. And this is not my prediction, but Casey Claffey, who was one of my advisors, basically predicts some sum of zones of trust will emerge to provide this transparency and accountability, and sort of manners is along the lines of what she was thinking of. And with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Hi, Tony Tauber, Comcast. On the previous slide, I don't know if you, so obtaining fraudulent IR records. I mean, I guess you have some examples. I don't know,
Yes, so I'm happy to chat with you. I don't have them on the slides.
Okay, sure.
I should have had backup, but I don't. There is also a paper in which we have listed multiple examples, and there is a CDF which shows the delta between things getting added to IRR and then starting to be BGP routed.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, also people probably know that IRR mostly has a weak authorization model, let's say, and so fraudulent is kind of for grabs, but getting there hopefully. So,
which is fair. I think when we spoke to folks, they were basically saying that for $500 you can add any entry that you want.
Yeah, it doesn't even cost that much.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thanks for the talk. Mike Holliman with VeriSign. I just have one question on the the prefixes that you saw that were hijacked with the ROA, with the origin ASIN of the ROA, were those ROAs that were signed with a max length that doesn't match what's advertised in the network? Or do you have any statistics on that as far as if the max length was exact prefix for what's announced in the routing system, and if not?
Right. So in this case, I think the answer is even simpler because they were not routed. So it didn't, like, the max length didn't really matter. But like, based on other instances, like, it does seem like max length would matter. But then also we have seen in our other studies looking at RPKI, we see that the max length field is often the most misconfigured one. And in fact, there was a paper somewhere which said that the max length is actually hurting operators than helping. And I don't know if that answers your question, but in this case, it didn't really matter because it's unrouted. So I don't know if it would have been.
Thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.